Good afternoon, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really honored to be here today with Anne Pollock and Camara Jones to celebrate Anne's newest book, Sickening Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States. This is an especially fun and exciting time for us because Anne Pollock served for many years on the board of Charis Circle, our nonprofit, and is known to many people in Atlanta as a longtime professor at Georgia Tech. So it's really always nice to sort of have Old Home Week and invite our friends back. So even though Anne Pollock is now halfway around the world in England, we through the miracle of technology, which we will talk a lot about technology today, but through this miracle of technology, we get to gather together. So I'm first going to introduce Camara Jones. She is an American physician, epidemiologist, and anti-racism activist who specializes in the effects of racism and social inequities on health. She is known for her work in defining institutional racism, personally mediated racism, and internalized racism in the context of modern U.S. race relations. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Jones drew attention to why racism and not race is a risk factor and called for actions to address structural racism. So welcome, Dr. Jones.
Thank you.
And the person of the hour today is Dr. Anne Pollock, who is a professor of global health and social medicine at King's College London. Her research explores feminist, anti-racist, and post-colonial engagements with science, technology, and medicine. Broadly, she is engaged in ongoing research in three intersecting areas: racism and health, feminist theory, and biomedicine, and social studies of pharmaceuticals. She serves on the lead editorial team of Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience, and as an associate editor at Biosocieties. She's the author of Medicating Race, Heart Disease, and Durable Preoccupations with Difference, and Synthesizing Hope, Matter, Knowledge, and Place in South African Drug Discovery, and the book we are celebrating today, Sickening Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States. So we want to invite everyone who is watching from home to please comment at any time. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know how you know these two wonderful folks. You also can buy the book, Sickening, by clicking this teal button. Just so you know, it officially comes out on Tuesday, so it will ship on Tuesday. This is a pre-publication event. It's very exciting and very special to get to do the pre-publication launch with Anne. And finally, if you would like to ask a question, you may click this Ask a Question button at the bottom center of your screen, or put it in the chat, and I will move it over to make sure that we attend to it when the time is right. So I'm going to get out of the way and let Dr. Jones take it from here. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you, ER. And so first of all, thank you, Anne, for writing this book. I loved it. I loved reading it because you're just a great writer. And I also think that people will find it very accessible. I want you to tell me, why did you structure the book the way that you did? And if you could describe to us how the book is structured.
So first of all, thank you so much, Camara, for being here today. My work is so inspired by yours. As you'll know when you read the book, I framed the book.
I've read it.
In terms of, but for our audience here, right, I think that the framing that I learned from Camara, from her first written work and then from the Racism and Health Working Group at the CDC and kind of events around Atlanta, I mean, it's just so foundational. And I think a lot of it really comes out of Atlanta. And it's also, thank you to ER, to Dartricia, to others at Charis, and then to my academic and activist communities in Atlanta, who really informed this book. And I would also say one additional group of Atlantans that informed the book is my former students. So the reason that the book is really structured around case studies that look through the 21st century events that have happened since 2001 is that I find case studies to be really useful in the classroom. Students really can connect with a story. So it starts with the first story in the book is about the postal workers who died in the Anthrax attacks, and really, kind of looks at the what might have happened otherwise, anchored in a 911 call that one of the postal workers made, describing his efforts to get care, to get information from his governmental employers, which were thwarted. And so by looking at the case, students can really see, okay, you know, what is going on at a micro level in the small domain of this individual postal worker who is going to a doctor, calling 911, talking to employers, what's going on in Washington, D.C. in 2001, and then what's going on in racism and health in the U.S. So it's really set up in a kind of a pedagogical mode, and really around the 21st century, first and foremost, because I think that when we teach, we often start with colonialism and slavery, which is really important. It's really important to understand the history of how racial health disparities have come to pass. This is not an accident. This is very much a system that has been built in. And yet, one of the problems with starting historically is that students tend to think, oh gosh, I'm glad I'm not from the past, you know, and get a sense that, like, you know, we're kind of moving in a better direction, and the past is where bad things are, the future is where good things are. But that's a choice, right? The future is only where good things are if we seek together to build that society. And so that's why, even though the cases are all 21st century, so from 2001 on through 2017, when Serena Williams' child was born, and she almost died in childbirth, right? Which is an extraordinary thing that such a powerful superstar as Serena Williams would also face denial of access to medicine, would also face challenges in getting care. You know, that this is a, it really is framed around those events, but then draws in the history and draws in the society as it becomes relevant. So that's basically the structure.
Yeah, I think so. You have these 6 case studies, but they aren't all about healthcare. So you have the postal workers, you know, you have the I don't remember them in order. So you can, but you have the 6, but they're in different things. The one that stuck out to me the most, in terms of all of these 6 case studies, all of us know. We don't have to read your book. These were in the news. Can you just name what the 6 are?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think almost all of them will be familiar to people. So first, the postal workers who died in the Anthrax attacks. I actually don't know that everyone remembers that. There is, and especially since so many of, like, my students weren't even born then. I teach a lot of undergraduates who were born in 2001, 2002, and so on. And so I think some might not be familiar with that, but many of us will remember, right, this event in the sweep of September 11th. But others are very big stories. So Hurricane Katrina, for example. But what the book does is takes a smaller element within that of looking at how there was a spike in chronic disease after Hurricane Katrina, which how can a natural disaster cause chronic disease, right? So this is not infectious disease, but things like heart disease, diabetes, right? So how did that happen, right? So huge story, but a small element of it. And then the Scott sisters case is another one that not everyone has heard about, but this is 2 sisters who were serving double life sentences for a trivial crime in a Mississippi prison, and they were released, conditional release, suspended sentences, dependent on one sister donating her kidney to the other sister. Now, the kidney donation didn't exactly come to pass that way, but this kind of egregious case illuminates a lot about the abuses of mass incarceration. And then the Flint water crisis is, again, something that people are very familiar with. But what the book does is takes a very small element of that, which is that General Motors noticed that there was a problem with the water right away because they have an engine plant that they noticed that when they got the new water supply, it corroded the machinery. And they were able to change the water source quite quickly before the damage became permanent, versus the people of Flint waited years, right, to be addressed. And then the police brutality case in the book is the Dejaria Becton case, which this was the McKinney, Texas case, right, where there was a girl in a bikini who was pinned down by police officers, and the viral video was filmed by one of her classmates. And so this is an opportunity to think about segregation and the impact of our housing, including in the suburbs.
Yeah, and this was the whole pool thing, right? This was where they went to a pool party.
Exactly.
Yes. Right.
Exactly. And so, right. So this was, and there's, of course, as you, I'm sure know, there's a huge history of pools and racial segregation. And so, this is a case that is both about the power of social media and the way that media is used today, but it's also a story about the history of, why do we even have neighborhood associations that have pools? And a lot of that is the history of disinvestment in public infrastructures in our cities that create this, right? And so that's the fifth case. Sorry, I'm going into a lot of detail here. And then the sixth case is Serena Williams' birth story. So each of these is meant to kind of highlight different elements. So this kind of moment of terrorism, this question of unnatural disaster, mass incarceration, environmental racism, and reproductive injustice. So, so that way, if you're a student, but also if you're just an interested reader, you can kind of work through these different domains and see a lot of intersecting elements. Or people can absolutely read just one chapter if they want to, or just the introduction, just the conclusion, that kind of thing.
Well, as I said, your writing is beautiful, and the fact that people can perhaps even start with a case that they remember, and then read more deeply into that, and then they'll be like, "Oh wow, I never thought about it in that way," and then go around. But you also, this is not just to inform us about these cases, but you have a very interesting tool at the end of the book, because it's one thing to know history. And so what you're doing is giving people not just a long, long ago history, but the history that many of us have lived through, or that some people have been born into. But then, yeah, we need to know the history, but we have to move to action. So I'd love you to just explain a little bit about your tool.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So this, I call it the Sickening Assignment. And this is a version of an assignment that I like to use in my classes, where often, so in my classes, the students will have read about a bunch of different cases of whatever it is that we're studying. So at Georgia Tech, I used to teach one class called Science, Technology, and Race, another called Biomedicine and Culture. And so students would pick a particular topic to focus on that they would do research on. But how could they get that kind of analysis, going from looking at the examples in class to generating your own analysis is actually it takes a little bit of, it's helpful to have a little bit of scaffolding, a little bit of structure to help with that. And so I provide the Sickening Assignment at the end of the book that seeks to help teachers, students, but anyone to think about that. So it starts by mapping out the terrain. So by looking across scales. So in that postal worker example, right, so the 911 call is this really micro scale of an encounter around racism and health disparities. And then a meso scale. So here, the context of the Washington, D.C. Postal Service. And then the macro scale of what was going on in post 9/11 America, when there was this strong narrative that now we were all in this together. So our divisions wouldn't matter anymore, as we went into the 21st century. And, so then, kind of providing that example, the student would then go and take their own case and find a micro, meso, and macro scale, right? So a small, medium, and big scale. And then inform the account by reading. And so I give some tips for reading. So looking at the media accounts themselves, as well as activist sources, and making sure that you are, kind of continuing to inform your analysis as you enrich your analytical frame. And so I provide this whole list of things that people should pay attention to. So history, infrastructure, technology, economic context, and there's several. And the goal here is not just kind of a checklist, but to kind of look for opportunities of, oh, here's an additional element. Here's another way that I can, kind of enrich my analysis. And then in writing, remembering the humanity. So I think sometimes when we share things on social media that are really outrageous, there's just that move to anger, which is an important move. But at the same time, I think that sometimes these stories, are really, they're stories of suffering. And we need to remember that these are about people and write the account in a humane way. but at the same time, remember social justice. So not get so into the story that you kind of forget that kind of purchase there at the end. And then cite Black women is a really important thing, I think, for students. I think students don't always know about what we call citational politics. So in scholarship, who you cite is always a question that is, where do you locate expertise? And so alerting students to make sure that they're turning to relevant sources of expertise is also an important element. So the Sickening Assignment is designed that you could use it in a classroom, but I actually think that these kinds of approaches could be useful, whether you're in the classroom or whether you're not.
In fact, because when I was reading it, I didn't think about teaching it. I actually thought about it in community settings where you're trying to equip people toward activism. I really did. So as you're a teacher and you're still teaching right now at King's College. And so your students are very lucky to have this, and this will be very good in the classroom. But I really think that encouraging people to pay attention to what's going on, and then to start thinking this individual story is reflecting or hiding or somehow involving the racism that structures our society, and trying to figure out where and what's going on, and then what can we do about it. So here's my question to you, Anne. The last example that you included was Serena Williams' birth story, where she almost died because people didn't pay attention to what she said was happening in her postpartum. Pick one thing that's happened since then, that if you were going to add a seventh example to the book, and then help walk us through how we might use some of your principles in the Sickening Assignment. I'm sorry I didn't warn you that I was going to do this, Anne, but I think it could help us. Like, what's another thing that we all sort of saw happen? Well, of course, the murder of George Floyd, of course, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. In fact, those things actually tie very well, I guess, maybe with the anthrax, the lack of attention. So maybe talk about that. Talk about how your first example, where the postal worker calling 911 saying, I think I've been exposed to anthrax, I'm having this lung stuff and all, and gets no traction, and the narrative of we're all in this together. How does that play out today? How did that play out last year?
Yeah, I mean, obviously COVID is the kind of the shadow over the book as a whole. So I finished the first draft of this book in January 2020. That's when I turned it in. And then I received peer reviews at the same time that I actually had, and I'm not sure if they're on the call, but several of my friends read the book while it was under peer review. And then I had colleagues teach it as well. So I had some undergraduate classes reading the book at the same time in manuscript form. And then I got the peer reviews back and feedback from many friends and colleagues and their students that allowed me to talk about the implications of COVID, both in the introduction and in the conclusion. And I think that absolutely all of these cases are relevant, and the insights from all of the cases are relevant. So with the postal workers, thinking about the role that essential workers play and the ways that they're often treated as expendable, even when, there was this strong kind of sense of, okay, now we're all vulnerable. Well, there's a way in which that is a lie. And we saw that with COVID too, right? So, and the ways that there was a systematic failure to really protect those who were made vulnerable by the very specific conditions of what we were facing. And so that happened there. And really each of them has the same has elements that are really relevant throughout. And I think that the Serena Williams birth story, I think, is an important one for really understanding a key element about how it's not just class, and it's not just, that I think that throughout the book, there are elements that show how race and class intersect, because in the United States, as you've pointed out in your own work extensively, it's not a coincidence that different races are not equally distributed along class lines, right? So that's not a coincidence. And so that's why we shouldn't look at them separately. And we need to understand how class in the United States is very much a product of racism, shaped by racism, and inextricable from racism. And so I think that what the Serena Williams case does is help to see that's kind of an end case, like an extreme case of like, you know, your privilege will not always protect you, even if you're a superstar. Although she herself has said that, you know, you shouldn't have to be a superstar in order to be able to survive, right? And that she thinks that, you know, if she weren't a superstar, she's not sure she would have survived. And so that, I think, is a, you know, an important kind of thing to keep in mind, you know, throughout the analyses, I guess, in general. I think I've gotten a little bit far away from your question, but I guess what I would just add there is that I think that what Serena Williams has done in terms of using her social media platform to highlight work of reproductive justice advocates is actually a good example of the kind of work that can be done, right? So where, you know, she has learned a lot about maternal health disparities, has helped to share that information, but has helped to share it in a way that is not just about kind of the facts and figures, but is also about demanding change and saying, okay, you know, how can we create a situation in which women who give birth in the United States, and indeed anywhere, I mean, as I'm here in the United Kingdom now, but the United States case is very specific. You know, how can we create a world in which women will be believed and in which their maternal health is taken as serious as it needs to be, and you shouldn't have to be a superstar.
Right. I lost you for a little bit because, you know, I'm having a little bit of thing, but that seriously is what I heard. And I think I understood the end of that sentence. So I want to ask you about a term that you use. It's a more academic term about biopolitics, but you talk about it in the middle 4 chapters more. You talk about biopolitics, you talk about biological citizenship. These are things that some of us haven't heard of before. So if you wanted to just delve into those a little bit so that you can expand all of our frames.
Yeah, so this is a key kind of set of themes in my own area, which is science and technology studies. And some folks on the call may know Melissa Creary, who is a mentee of Dr. Jones's. And so, and she also works in this space. Jennifer Singh, I think, is on the call as well and does as well. And there are many more. And so on one level, it's a really straightforward thing. So this philosopher named Michel Foucault from back in the 80s and before, he argued that one of the things that is happening in kind of modernity is that the character of biopolitics is that the state and governmentality determines whose life is fostered and who is kind of allowed to die. So to make live certain groups of people who are considered to be desirable for whatever reason, and to let die. So the state won't necessarily kill people, although it might. So in war, for example, obviously in capital punishment as well. But where a lot of the violence is actually just letting die or failing to foster life. And so the way that this, so this is kind of a backdrop, is this kind of situation. And then the way that biological citizenship operates is trying to, when people try to make claims against the state, it could be against other actors too. It could be against private pharmaceutical companies, for example, but archetypally against the state and saying, you know what, my life needs to be fostered, and really kind of claiming citizenship. So I talk a little bit about Melissa Harris Perry and other political scientists in the opening of the book as well, and you know, who have really argued about how, you know, citizenship is so much more than just voting. It's taking a claim to the space of the society. And so what biological citizenship is saying that part of that is about health and our biological lived experiences. So health in its broad sense, right? So we're not just talking about, you know, whether you have access to the doctor, but also whether you have access to a community that's safe, whether you have access to food and water that is safe, whether you have this kind of ability to, like the situation that you are living in isn't one of kind of constant stress that is antithetical to flourishing. So, this really expansive definition of health, the demand for that is a biological citizenship demand. So not just that I have the right to vote, but that I have a right to flourishing.
And this is very interesting because structural racism often shows up as indifference and lack of action, inaction in the face of need. So that is the tie there, and the differential valuation. So I'd like to throw my definition of racism into our conversation, because now I'm understanding the crosswalks. Because when I talk about racism, I'm clear I'm talking about a system. So here's my definition in one sentence. Racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So that definition is my global definition that I published after I talked about the 3 levels that everybody knows about. But this is the definition that then is manifest through these 3 levels. And actually, when you talk about the valuation, the differential valuation, you talk about, what race is and what race isn't, and how the socially assigned race is carrying the day. So I really appreciate that. But also this fostering life and letting die is about inaction, indifference and inaction in the face of need. And when we think about how racism saps the strength of the whole society, many people don't recognize that. They don't recognize the loss of, when I think about the word citizenship, I think about caring about the whole. I mean, if I were to say one word or one quick thing, citizenship as caring about the whole. And this claim to biological citizenship is saying, care about me too. And I'm wondering, so I don't have the answer to this, how could these claims for biological citizenship help us also understand that when we don't, that we are sapping the strength of the whole society? That's one of the main impacts in my 3-fold impacts: unfair disadvantage, unfair reciprocal, unfair advantage, and then sapping the strength of the whole society, that I have not yet figured out how do we best communicate that. That's the message that we need to elevate most urgently right now in this time when there's so much racism denial, right? In fact, there are 4 key messages I would say. Racism exists, racism is a system, racism saps the strength of the whole society, and we can act to dismantle racism, right? And I think your book is good in terms of equipping us along those 4 things. But that racism saps the strength of the whole society is actually the most urgent of the 3 impacts, I think. And so I just want to work with you intellectually right now here in public. Is there something about this notion of biological citizenship? Is there anything that we could use to help people understand that? Maybe people don't understand. Yeah, maybe people don't understand 2 postal workers died from anthrax. How is that hurting the whole society? But is there a lesson that we missed with your first example that could have helped us with COVID?
I mean, I definitely think that there is. I mean, I think that so with all of the cases, there certainly is a way that this is impacting everyone. So the ways that HMOs operate is one of the things that kind of comes up in that chapter. And, for very quick decisions, which are often made in very much that way, right? So differentially advantaging some, disadvantaging others. But that structure of kind of a model of scarcity that is imposed in order to try to lower costs, but doesn't foster wellness or lower right? I mean, we see that we have, like in the United States, a very expensive healthcare system that delivers very poor health outcomes, and actually for everyone, right? I mean, so even privileged Americans have worse healthcare than they should, and but I think that it's even clearer maybe in the Flint chapter. So looking at the General Motors plant that was able to get safe water when the people of Flint weren't. Now, the people of Flint are racially diverse, so definitely strong African-American population, that there is, it is very much a racialized form of poverty that impacts the community. But this decision that is made of kind of differentially valuing the lives of that community is something that then has tremendous impacts for the community as a whole, right? Like, so the disinvestment happens in a way that is very much about deciding that some people don't matter, but then does go on to impact the community as a whole, right? I mean, and I think, there's just so much that's gone on there, and I think that that case is a poignant one because in Flint, it was under emergency financial manager. So the governor had appointed someone to run the city instead of its elected officials because of a so-called financial crisis. But then that person is not beholden to the people. Right. And those systems are really dangerous, right? So when we allow those systems to happen where there's this emergency financial manager who's only looking after the finances of the city and not the people of the city, like none of the children do well in that sort of model at all. And so, so there's definitely, this idea that the bondholders are an emergency and need to be addressed and taken care of by the state of Michigan, which is my home state, versus the children, right, who also need access to safe water. That this is kind of an ongoing, kind of crisis in some ways. I mean, now Flint has had a massive investment and has many more pipes, and there has been some recompense, but the problem is ongoing.
Are all of the pipes replaced? I actually don't know. The last I heard, they weren't.
But there has been some. Yeah, I don't know if. So I do have some friends from Michigan who may be here, maybe be able to weigh in the Q&A if they know the more updated information. But I think that that this system is bad for everybody. And I guess I would also say though that we should. I think Manu Platt might be on this call, and he's talked about the way that the argument that Black Lives Matter is important in part because if you believe that set is part of the whole, then that already does the work, right? So of saying that it should matter for the whole, right? And so he has a fun kind of math kind of way of illustrating it with figures because he's an engineering professor at Georgia Tech. I think that it is also something where we say that, yes, we actually do care about the differential impacts on minority communities too, not just because of the whole, but because everyone should be a member of the whole too.
Because we value all of us.
We value
all of us. And
absolutely.
And right now in our society, we don't. So what gives you hope?
Well, I think my students actually are the main thing that gives me hope. I mean, I do talk about various actors throughout who are doing good work. So Black doulas, for example, are doing great reproductive justice work. Sister Song there in Atlanta. Many organizations are doing that kind of work, and that is very inspiring. And that's really where I come from too. So at the same time that I started this kind of thinking in 2001 when I started my PhD with Evelyn Hammonds, was one of my professors, and these other folks kind of thinking through these things. And I came upon your work not long after that. But at the same time, it is been very much in conversation with community. So including at places like Charis, which is this great bookstore because it allows kind of more theoretical, feminist, and anti-racist work to sit together with the work that community folks are doing in different ways, in children's books and advice books and spirituality books and like all of these other kind of conversations that I think should be happening together. So I think that those community spaces are there, those academic conversations are there, and those are fantastic. But I do think that my students are really inspiring to me, because I think that they are increasingly unwilling to accept the argument that, this is how it is. I'm feeling like there's been a real shift. I mean, maybe, there was, obviously in the 60s and before my time, there was a kind of a radicalism. When I was coming up, I'm kind of on the Gen X side of things, it was much less so. And so I'm really heartened to see young folks today much more engaged than I'd seen them in my previous 10 years of teaching in universities.
What we need to do is figure out how to grab those lessons from history, including recent history that you have in this book, and how to learn from them and keep moving. Otherwise, we're going to have this fluctuating attentiveness, social justice activism, whatever. We're going to have the pendulum go this way, and then somebody's going to push it back that way. And I've been thinking, how do we put, if you've ever rented a car from the airport and then you're going to return it to the airport and you drive it into the rental car return thing, they have these spikes, like you can't back it out or people can't take cars out the wrong way. How do we, in terms of social justice, lay spikes in the road so that when we make progress that we can't go back, but maybe we have, and maybe the going back, maybe the people who are trying to take us back don't care if the whole car is going to get destroyed. That seems to be the point we're in right now. But I've been thinking about it in that way. How do we not go 3 steps forward, 2.5 steps back, or 4 steps forward, 4 steps back? How do we keep moving? And so I think that, first of all, I appreciate this book so much, and that you're writing it and pulling together contemporaneous history as opposed to old history, and saying that we still have these struggles, and then giving people tools to think about when the next thing happens tomorrow on the news, what does it mean and where do we go? I think that's useful. I'm hopeful too because of young people. But hope in young people, we've been investing our hope in young people for a long time, and I don't know what else we need. So maybe it's time for you to answer, then open it up to other Q&A from our listeners, and see maybe there's somebody who can drop something in the Q&A box that's an answer. So anyway.
Yeah, maybe they've got it figured out. I don't know. But I do think that there's, so just a couple of folks saying kind words. So yes, I do think that there's always hope in the youth and for the youth and so on, and that's always there. But I do think that this, the confluence of the era of Black Lives Matter together with the kind of post-financial crisis skepticism about the market will kind of sort it out, combined with COVID and this time in which people are like, you know what, maybe we don't want to live in this same way, I am more optimistic, I guess, than I have been maybe before. But I also think that, hope is something that, actually I talked about this more in my previous book, which is called Synthesizing Hope, and is, very much about this. But that, hope, so for folks like Paulo Freire and other kind of philosophers of liberation, will talk about, hope is a practice. It's not just a blind optimism. It is necessary to do the work, and it, the reason, like the hope is kind of the engine, even, of the work. Right. And for me, I feel like one of the things that I'm interested in doing is, I don't want to kind of be the professor forever, right? I want to kind of create. There is kind of a liberation theology vibe to a lot of the stuff too, because like I might not get there with you, right? That kind of element of, but I have confidence that the next generation, when given these tools, will be able to get further than the previous. And so, so I think as long as there is that kind of commitment to both truth and to justice, then I think that's maybe where my hope comes from.
And a commitment to connecting to younger people, and a commitment to creating enough torches that you can pass them on and on and on behind, and then they can pass them on, and a realization that one generation won't do this, but we have to act, we have to start, and each generation needs to keep moving forward. I don't know. So you've escaped the U.S. 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So you don't. So maybe you have a better idea of what's happening in the U.S. than we have right now. Maybe you have a clearer idea, but you aren't feeling it as much as we are. But in the U.S. right now, there are people who are, there's the whole anti-critical race theory element that is trying to sweep through the Republican-held states and keep us from even talking about history or anti-racism or equity or social justice or any of those things. I mean, they might, I mean, God forbid, don't look at this book if you're in that group, right? But there's that. At the same time, that there are 208 jurisdictions across 37 states that have made formal declarations that racism is a public health crisis. So we have 37 states where at least one city council or one county commission or a state legislature or sometimes a governor's statement, in 11 states it was at the state level, 37 states against all these other states that are trying to suppress the vote of people of color, trying to say you can't teach about history and anti-racism and all of these things. We are at, I heard Sherilyn Ifill quote somebody else to say that a dying mule kicks hardest. That's where we are. And so we have to realize that that's where we are, and we have to be intentional. We have to use all of our tools and all of our insights to stay in the struggle and to name racism in the ways you have the impacts on health, on the criminal legal system, housing, the wealth, all of that, talk about that, but then move to action. I'm hopeful too, like you are, but it's not, as you say, it's a practice. Hope is a practice.
Yeah, and
Hope
I think
practice.
I am far away now, still involved. I mean, I know that I was talking about how voting is not the be all and end all, but it was kind of exciting to be here, hearing about the Fulton County overseas and absentee ballots being counted, right? And that's my vote. And the Democrats Abroad Black Caucus had me talking about this book and these various things, and these things, these things really coming together is exciting. So folks like Stacey Abrams doing this work, friend of Charis, so I think that these can be, very interconnected elements, right? So kind of getting those analytical tools, doing the kind of, yes, voting does matter kind of piece of it. But not everyone is eligible to vote. I mean, I'm not eligible to vote in the UK, but still, think that it's important to participate in the conversations. And so, that there's kind of multiple angles, I think, that we should all be going on. I do think that it's true that being outside the US, you get kind of a critical perspective on it that is a bit different. I've always traveled a lot, and even just the fact that I'm from Northern Michigan, did my education in Boston, and then lived in Atlanta, so kind of each of those kind of for decades, was that already kind of creates a little bit of a sense of critical perspective. And I know you've moved around quite a bit as well. But I think that, with the book, I tried to make sure that people from outside the United States would be able to understand it. And sometimes that does take looking at the United States like a foreign country. I remember with my first book, I had a chapter about a drug called Bidil. So it's drug, it's for heart failure in self-identified Black patients, approved in 2005. And I said to a British friend of mine, I was living in Atlanta at the time, and I said, oh, could you please read it and flag things that you don't understand, because I want this to be picked up internationally. And she said, okay, there are these terms that I don't know, like pharmaceutical benefit management company. I was like, oh my God, that's the most American word that there is. And I never noticed. It was invisible to me as someone who looks at health policy. I mean, obviously those things are very confusing anyway, but that kind of thing I think is really good. And so I would also, I do think that it's helpful sometimes to try to kind of, as much as I am American and am still committed to justice there, I also think that it is helpful sometimes to try to look a little bit from outside too. And
what do we need to know? And what do we need to know right now? What warning do you give us right now?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really interesting time there. I mean, we were even talking about these things around the ways that the testing is organized there versus the way that it's organized here. Like, it doesn't have to be like that. I was telling people about how, when I got my vaccine here, they just texted me and said, it's your turn. Do you want one of these times in a place that is very close to your house that you can walk to? If those times don't work for you, let me know another that does, right? I mean, there are other ways that things can be structured versus like kind of like Hunger Games style that the United States tends to go for. And so I think that is something maybe that would be useful to kind of bear in mind. Right. So it's not just about, okay, am I the quickest on the Twitter? Or am I the quickest? That there's always that kind of impetus for that kind of, this is part of biological citizenship too, a kind of neoliberal, like, I'm going to go and be agential and I'm going to get things done so that my health is protected. And it's not always as clear how the system can protect the society's health. So really, like, keeping those questions.
I'd love to open it up now to our Q&A. You did make me think of one piece of my work I'd like to throw in after we answer questions. But ER, if you could come back, because you volunteered to help us with the Q&A. So, and even ER, if you have any questions to open us up with.
Yeah, well, actually, we have a lot of great questions in the chat. So I think let's start with those because I think they're all really, really good and deep questions. So Jennifer Singh has sort of a two-part question. So I want to begin with those. So the first is there a website or blog associated with the book? It might be useful to start cataloging how students utilize the Sickening Assignment.
Yeah, great point. No, I haven't. I mean, there is a website for the book, which is, the publisher. So if you just Google Sickening, it's published by the University of Minnesota Press, which does great work around racism and health. A whole bunch of books. Tony Hatch, who folks may know, Atlanta reader. So he, also his book is also from Minnesota. And Alondra Nelson, who many people may have come across, her first book was with Minnesota. I mean, so they do have a lot of work in this area. I have not built it out much. And so I absolutely should do that. So thank you, Jen, for the encouragement. Because, I always try, it's such a struggle, right? I mean, I think that, for those of us who are academics, and I mean, Camara, I know you want to write books, and we all would love your books, absolutely. But it's so hard to kind of carve out that time for that work. And so if folks have suggestions about how to kind of structure it in a way that it's like, that you can kind of manage together with the teaching and the research and the institutional work, right? Then I would love that. But it's a good point. I mean, I have my own website. I have my syllabi from my classes that I teach and that kind of thing. And even that I feel like is a helpful resource that I wish more academics would do. But yeah, I should get on that. So thank you.
Well, and Jennifer's second question, I think, feeds into this. So have any of the actors or their communities who are part of the case studies read the book? And if so, what has been their response? If not, do you plan to give a book talk with some of these communities? And how might they use your Sickening tool? So, perhaps even developing a tool with some of the communities. It seems to be one of Jennifer's suggestions.
Yeah, so I mean, not precisely. I mean, I think that, so with the exception of having many people read the draft and stuff, so including Dartricia, who maybe is here and is very much a part of the Charis community and a feminist activist community in Atlanta, right? So, and then other friends in Michigan and in other places, right? So, but that's much more individuals. Right, rather than kind of like working in community directly. And so I do look forward to that. I mean, I'm hoping to come to the United States soon. I mean, this has just been a really hard time to plan. because a lot of that work, it does take ongoing engagement. Like you can't just kind of like helicopter in and give a talk and expect to get feedback, right? So, versus like, a doula in Michigan who read it, Faith Grossbeck, she, like we have an ongoing relationship. So then that she gives me, that perspective and more, right? Everyone is more than one thing. But I think that'll be a slower process in the context of COVID, that it's hard to think about like, okay, how can I go and travel to these places? I would love to, but we'll see. And I'm going to speak to Jennifer Singh's class in November, hopefully. So.
Oh, good. So Rita Valenti, who is a community health worker and awesome.
Nurse Rita.
Asks, is it time to gather folks, those most impacted, scholar activists like yourselves, healthcare workers, healers, professionals, etc., to discuss and develop collectively the healthcare infrastructure we actually need in this country? A vision of what is not only possible, but actually necessary, that ends biopolitics, the metabolic rift, and corporate medicine that kills us. The pandemic has brought this all into sharp relief. Seems like an urgent responsibility.
Absolutely. Do you want to speak to that, Camara?
Yes. The answer is yes, it is time. Yes, it is time. And I think that people are ready. I think that people's eyes are more open to the interconnectedness of all of this, and that health. I mean, it's interesting to me that the question, why do we have all of these declarations, even the CDC saying racism is a public health crisis? Why didn't they say racism is an educational crisis, which it is, or it's a criminal legal crisis, or it's a housing crisis, or it's an environmental justice crisis, which it is, all of those things. But the reason that people started talking about racism as a public health crisis, maybe it had something to do with, I launched our national campaign against racism from APHA in 2016, a little bit. There's a little bit of that in there, but it's because we recognize that our bodies, ourselves, the biological citizenship, this is me, that all of these systems impinge. And then we're like the litmus paper for the conditions of our lives. And so health is the thing. So I think that we as health people, sometimes we want everybody to come to our health table. I think that's not the answer. But I think that we recognize the impacts of other things on health, whereas other people may not recognize that as much. So that what we need to do is organize among ourselves, but also go to the education table and sit and listen and be there for a while, be part of that. Go to the community organizing table, go to the investment table, go to the environment table and be there. And then as we listen, say, we're thinking about the same things. These are the resources we can bring. And in that way, not bring everybody to the health table and expect them to come and prioritize health, but to recognize that all of these things impinge on health by going to their tables. So,
yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And nurses like Rita are so important in this work too. I mean, I think that sometimes in medical sociology, people pay more attention to the physicians. And this is not to impugn fantastic physicians like you, but a lot of times, I mean, that nurses are not always, but can be structurally well positioned to see the ways in which health is so much more than a medical matter, right? So that is something that is kind of a slogan of my department, Global Health and Social Medicine. So a lot of what needs to change is within the health system, and that is true, right? So it shouldn't be that Americans are worried about, becoming completely financially destitute from a health crisis, right? Like that should not be the case. And that is a health question, because the decision to set up a healthcare that way is a decision that is political and can and should change. But a lot of the other stuff, right, is also about the whole way that the social world is structured, right? So, and so the going to the education table and going to the neighborhood table is also, those are health things too, right? Those all impact our health too. And they also matter for their own reasons. I mean, I think, this kind of the fostering of human flourishing has to be also intellectual as well as embodied. And I think that people just find the embodied really really compelling too.
And I think that when we go to the other tables, we have to also go recognizing how racism structures, differentially structures opportunity, exposures, how we're valued, all of those things. Because sometimes people will say, okay, well, if we just address the social determinants of health, then we're done. It's the same argument that you talk about, like if we just address class differences, then we're done, without recognizing, first of all, that these class differences by race don't just so happen, but also even if we were to eliminate class differences today, if we were to equalize income today, but if we had not addressed the background structures, policies, practices, norms, values of structural racism, then in one generation we would start to see differential, income, wealth, et cetera, by class.
Yeah.
Right. So I actually would just like to let people know that if you want to see like a 5-minute reduction of my cliff analogy, the Urban Institute did a 5-minute whiteboard, that I speak over, and, I scripted and all, but it's talking about, when you talk about 3 different levels of health intervention or dimensions of health intervention, you have the health services, ambulance, net fence at the edge of a cliff. You have addressing social determinants of health, moving people away from the edge of the cliff. And you have addressing the social determinants of equity, recognizing and addressing that we're dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, and that resources and populations are not equally distributed along those. So that, I think that for health, even if we're working as an ambulance driver, we need to recognize, we need to wonder what's happening above us. Is there a net of fence? How close are people to the edge? Where are we in the 3-dimensional cliff? Do we act the same way? But all of us as citizens, again, need to care about the whole and need to be addressing the 3-dimensionality of the cliff.
I just put that link in the chat for folks to watch. And just so folks know, the links will stay up after the event is over, so you don't need to rush and click them all. They will be here. So our final question is from Manu Platt. And he says, I love Dr. Jones reading your book from an activist perspective. How do we apply that as communities fight for their own safety during schools reopening without COVID safety protocols? What instructions inside can we use? And I'll just add to this, this is the fight that parents are going through right now is varying, county to county, school district to school district. And, I'm talking to friends across the country, and in some districts, they're like, oh, my school administrators are great. It's fine. They're doing contact tracing. They're doing all this really helpful stuff. And then I have other friends who are saying, yeah, we have no expectation of safety at all for our child. And we're having to make really hard decisions about, do I miss work? Do I do this? What should I do? And literally, if my child has a COVID exposure, the school doesn't even notify us, right? So there's just a wide range of experiences around this. And so much of it is wrapped up in, is this a Republican-controlled area? What's going on? And so what advice do you have? And solve our horrible U.S. COVID policies, especially with regard to children.
In one fell swoop.
Yeah.
Right.
No biggie.
Yeah, look, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. And I think that, this is something that will reverberate, I think, for years to come. So in the same way that, so like this book is kind of over the last 20 years, I think that these are some really powerful bookends of like kind of 9/11 as this time in the US that it did feel like, okay, we're like now entering into a new moment, and now we're in that moment again, right? And a different one, like the next one, right? So the book is really about kind of the 20 years in between. But I think that the same questions like are always there. And I think part of it is about, thinking about like, there's a lot of technical elements that you're highlighting there about how will contact tracing operate and so on. And those are really important. But I guess I also do think that there are some kind of more macro level things that remain important throughout. And so, in teaching during this time has been really poignant, kind of seeing the differential backgrounds and the differential like childcare labor that my students are doing and different things, all of the like kind of holding, all of those things at the same time is something that I know that Dr. Manu Platt is very good at, kind of holding the technical and the social together, I think is something that we have to keep on working toward. I don't know, Camara, if you have better solutions.
No, I just, we don't care about all of us. We do not have a collective consciousness. And it's, it disadvantages some, advantages others, but saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources, and we don't even see the waste. And the people who are advantaged feel lucky to be advantaged or like they've earned it to be advantaged. They don't recognize that they're structurally advantaged because they don't read history. Actually, this, I just backed into something that I wanted to throw into the end of our conversation. So I'm just going to throw it in right now, which is that I have identified 7 US cultural, I'd say white US cultural characteristics that are barriers to achieving health equity. I'll say them really quickly. We're narrowly focused on the individual that makes systems and structures invisible or seemingly irrelevant. We're ahistorical, and we act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. We endorse the myth of meritocracy, that if you work hard, you'll make it. And I give you that most people who have made it have worked hard, although not everybody who's made it has worked hard. We have some very prominent examples of that, right? But even as most people who have made it have worked hard, there are many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field that's been structured and is being perpetuated by racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, all of these systems of structured inequity. And when we deny the existence of those systems, we blame people who haven't made it for being lazy or stupid. Many ways to deny racism, but I won't go there, except to say that if you never say the word racism in the context of US widespread racism denial, you are denying racism. You're complicit with that denial. So the first 3 I said were narrow focus on the individual, ahistorical stance, myth of meritocracy. The 4th is our endorsement of the myth of a zero-sum game. If you gain, I lose. This is the whole pool. So now Heather McGee has a book. You talked about the pool thing that happened in McKinney, Texas. Her book on the sum of us talks about what is it? The closed pool, the filled pool politics or something like that, that white communities that had community pools would rather fill in their pool than share them with Black folks. And that's the whole thing. So that it's like you're sitting at like I'm sitting at a potluck dinner table. I see you coming. I don't want you anywhere near it because I think you're just going to come and eat up all the food. I can't even see that you're bringing all kinds of cakes and pies and roasts and fruits and salads with you, because I can't even value you. So that's number 4. 5th is, in this country, in the US, we have a limited future orientation, recognizing that the parts of the future, as we were talking about, that all of us hopefully can touch today that will survive us are the children and the planet. But we have a disregard for the children, usurious relationship with the planet. And our disregard with the children, when I call this a white stance, there are many American Indian nations, indigenous North American communities that have a 7 generations idea when they're making decisions. They think about a 100-year plan. The white US stuff that's guarding all of us does not. And East African Maasai people, I am told, greet one another not with, hey, how you doing, but with the question, how are the children? Hoping to hear the answer, all the children are well. And we don't even ask in the US, how are the children? And if we did, we would not get the answer, all the children are well. The 6th of the 7 is this myth of US exceptionalism that we call American exceptionalism because we don't care about Canada, Mexico, Central South America. But this myth of US exceptionalism, which makes us, as you said, Anne, we don't even know what other countries are doing with regard to COVID or with regard to access to test or anything like that. We don't even, it makes us feel so ordained by God that we feel entitled and we think there's nothing we can learn from other nations. And then the 7th is the foundational value piece in all of this, which is white supremacist ideology, which is at the basis, that's the false idea of a hierarchy of human valuation by race. There is no such hierarchy. with the falser notion, for those people who believe that there's a hierarchy, with the false notion that would put white people at the top as the ideal or the norm. But that gives many people who are living as white a sense of entitlement. It results in the devaluation and dehumanization that you have talked about, that you've documented in your stories of people of color, and fear at the browning of America that underlies a lot of our political divide today, which we've been talking about, which is at a crucible level that maybe we in the US can't even see as clearly as you can, Anne. But anyway, so I throw those in to say that as I was reading your book, I was like, oh, Anne's got that, and she's got that, and she's got that. So, but this is how I've been thinking about these things, not only as barriers to achieving health equity, but as values targets for anti-racism action. We think about the structural targets of, the addressing the healthcare system, or how we fund public schools based on local property taxes, or how, environmental racism or residential segregation. We got the structural stuff a little bit in our minds, what to do. But these values that we are swimming through in the US context that we don't even recognize, we can't see the water in which we're swimming. These are the 7, and 4 of them undergird the intergenerational transmission of racism denial. The narrow focus on the individual, what system? System?
Exactly. Right.
Historical.
What am I swimming in? There's water?
Right. The myth of meritocracy and the white supremacist ideology. And racism denial is a huge problem in our nation. It's a black hole. So anyway, I talked too much, Anne. So thank you for inviting me.
It's such an important kind of set of analytical frames that you've articulated here. And so I think that, the idea piece, I think, is one that maybe the book can't do. I mean, I do think that this book is for people who are inclined to think that racism is a problem and want to understand it better. And maybe they will take the argument to people who don't think so, right, who are in that denial phase. But I've found that a lot of times in my teaching and in my engagement more broadly, people are like, oh, I know that this is a serious problem. I don't know how to talk about it. And, so that, I think that's where this goes. So I think that it's just one small piece of the work, right? So one small piece of the work is kind of, okay, let's get this analysis together so that we can get a little bit of a sense of, okay, what is going on in this country? And, why is it where it is? What are the structures that are keeping it this way? And the denial piece, I mean, that is going to be another piece, Yes. That is going to be another piece of work to try.
It's a huge piece, actually, because it's like a black hole in the universe, and they're called black holes because we can't see them. Why can't we see them? They're so massive that when light comes near them, it can't escape. And that's how racism denial is operating in the US right now. It's so massive, but we can't even see it. And it's sucking up truth, and it's threatening to suck up talking about history and all of that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if one of the things that obviously we know is that anti-Black racism and white supremacy work by reiterating themselves differently all the time, so morphing and showing up in different ways. And one of the things that I am very worried about, and I think your book speaks to, Anne, is that we're creating a division around health meritocracy, right? Like this that gets coded as colorblind, right? That people who have, supreme health, whether that's, showing up in a body that people perceive as ideal, or who spend all this time biohacking and doing all this kind of Silicon Valley, super duper, attuning for, whatever the most, ideal brain is, all that stuff that's going on, right? That is a hobby of the wealthy class right now, which is overwhelmingly white and male. Those, we're creating this, we're deepening the divide, right, between people who can access, this kind of supreme uber health and everybody else. And while that's not currently coded racially, it is absolutely racially coded, right? And as more and more, all of this technology of health is becoming more central to our culture, right? You know, plenty of people have written about like your insurance company giving you a
pedometer or whatever.
Yeah,
Step
yeah,
app. Yeah.
yeah, or an app that you have to use on your phone. Like that is really dangerous because you know it's separating people into classes. So I'm just wondering, you know, to me that seems like the next iteration of how white supremacy will reproduce with regard to health. But I'm wondering kind of, you know, what your thought about that is, especially post COVID. I mean, not or ongoing COVID, because I don't think we're going to be post anytime soon.
Yeah. I mean, right. I mean, less, except insofar as we're like post World War II, like we still are post World War II, right? And I think that, and there's so many elements of the past that are living in the present. So, you know, one of the ones that I talk about is that Ruha Benjamin, who I know many of you will be familiar with her work, also talks a lot about, is the way that distrust is not just a legacy of a horrific history. It's something that is constantly cultivated in the present. And so, you know, there's often like kind of this lamentation of like, wow, why don't people trust vaccines? Why don't they trust the system? Why don't they trust this? It's like, okay, well, what are you doing to be trustworthy here, right? And so how do we make institutions earn trust, right? So rather than kind of always turning to like, what's going on with people not trusting? It's like, okay, what's going on with institutions not being trustworthy? And I think that kind of piece is really fundamental to this, actually. Like, you know, the insisting that the institutions be trustworthy. And it goes to those same things with the schools. Like, reasonable people actually might disagree about a particular narrow policy or something. But the reason that it becomes this kind of broad question about citizenship and who even counts as an American, right? Who even counts as a member of the community is because the institutions have not shown themselves to be trustworthy. And I think that that's really where a lot of this struggle is. And so a lot of biological citizenship literature does focus on that super high tech, super, you know, kind of fancy, futuristic kind of work. But I think that a lot of the stakes are right there, are not at that place, right? They're at a very like, is everybody who's here a member of the community? Is everybody who's here a citizen?
And what you just said also made me think about an earlier conversation we had about inside outside strategies and also making institutional walls more porous. I mean, do you want to share some of our conversation with that about that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, so a lot of times academics, you know, and students think about what we can do to change our institutions, and that is important. And sometimes people will even say, you know, that the like put one above the other, right? So like, okay, academics have to follow this community, and community has to follow as well experts, you know, those things. But actually, like by kind of going back and forth and kind of being in those, bringing like really, and I think Charis is so great about this actually, like so kind of authentically having people be in both conversations. Some of the people will be in both conversations, some of the people will be in others. And, you know, can help you to find those allies on the insides of powerful institutions. So, so Camara Jones used to be at the CDC, Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. Of course, everybody in Atlanta knows where that is. I don't know where folks are joining from in this call. But you know, that had this Racism and Health Working Group at the CDC that included members from outside. So I attended some of their things, but lots of people from lots of different kinds of domains. And I think that those things can be like literal examples of that. But also I would say that for anybody who is an activist, who doesn't have ties to academia, but who wants potentially access to resources that can flow through that, or information, or to, you know, be able to connect with students and other things, look for allies inside the institutions, because they're always there. And even in institutions, governmental institutions, they're there too. There will, like, none of them are monoliths. So the university is not a monolith. The city government is not a monolith. The federal government is not a monolith. There's always going to be, you know, kind of people within there who are interested in hearing, like, okay, what is this kind of progressive or feminist or anti-racist intersectional feminist critique, you what are they saying that I can kind of help to operationalize within my institution.
Yeah, so we have a very practical question, but an important one. Sharon asked, will you produce an audiobook?
Yes, I was actually just contacted by this. The publisher just heard from an audiobook production company just the other day. So yeah, that's in the works. So I do, and I appreciate ER's guidance too on how to make sure that audiobook distribution also happens through channels that are not evil and are instead, able to channel through feminist and other channels too. And so, yeah, I'm very excited about that. This is my third book, but it is the first one that is kind of accessibly enough written that I think that would be a logical thing. And so I really hope that it can reach more audiences that way too. So, so the paperback book is coming out on Tuesday. I'm not sure when the audiobook will be coming out, but hopefully very soon.
And do you already know what your next book's going to be about?
I don't know, actually. I think people think that I write books all the time. And so far I've written 3. I do have a lot of different projects kind of going on. It's not clear which one is going to be the next book. I continue to be very interested in feminism and heart disease. But I feel like there's been a lot of kind of rather boring conversations about how heart disease is a feminist issue. And I think that there are some other ones that we could have. And of course, that's very much an intersectional feminist issue as well. But at the same time, I'm thinking that a book is not necessarily what I'm going to do next, that I might be at a place where I'm looking at other kinds of writing, engaging in additional kinds of ways. So we'll see.
Great.
And I want to work with you on your book. So in a narrow sense, let's write some op-eds and do some of those kinds of things. But then also in the longer term, I'm also very interested in thinking about fostering other authors. So up and coming kind of academics and other folks who want to engage in these conversations. So I'm seeing kind of having that mid-career moment or senior moment. I don't know. Senior moment means something different in academia, which is a very, very hierarchical kind of structure. About what else can I be fostering? It doesn't have to be just what I'm saying, but how can I be fostering other authors and building books that way too?
Yeah. Well, this has been lovely. Thank you both so much. And it's always a special pleasure for us to get to celebrate the work of a friend and a longtime comrade. So we're really, really excited. Dr. Jones, it's so nice to have you in the space. And we hope we get to work with you again and possibly on celebrating a book of yours. We want to encourage folks to please click this teal link to buy Sickening Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States. From us, it really does help Charis when you purchase a book from us. It helps us get to do this work. And if you would like to make a donation to Charis Circle, our nonprofit, that also, of course, helps us, and it does pay for this platform and for Dartricia's and my labor. So we appreciate you. And finally, I'll just say I'll be adding captions to this and putting it up on our YouTube channel. Usually it takes about 36 to 48 hours to get up there. You can share this link at any time, and then also just be on the lookout for that one because it is more accessible, and we do prefer you to share that one. So thanks, everybody, so much for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. We hope that you all stay safe and well. And until next time, we'll see you here in the internet. So take care.
Thank you so much, ER and Dartricia and Camara and everyone. Bye.
And congratulations, Anne.